Good evening and welcome to Nurturing Our Roots. I'm sorry, we're having some kind of feedback. Let's see where that's coming from. Okay, I think I got that. But anyway, welcome to Nurturing Our Roots, the journey from slavery to freedom, live Zoom sessions with Antoinette and Karen. We're live every Tuesday at 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. The talk show where ordinary people with extraordinary family stories can be heard. If you have a family story and would like to share it with us, Karen and I would love to hear your family story. So please contact us at nurturingourroots@gmail.com. I'm Antoinette, and here's Karen. Hi, Karen slash cousin and colleague and co-host.
Hi, Antoinette. How are you this evening?
I am doing wonderful. Thank you for asking. I am so excited for the show that we're getting ready to have tonight. So for anybody that's joining us, please, I would like to say to you, you want to hear what our guests have to say. So Karen, here it is at you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. And if you're joining us in the chat room, please just put a question, or if you have comments you want us to share, put those in the chat, and I will be looking at the chat from time to time. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Phoebe Hayes. And tonight, we will be talking about Dr. Hayes's journey since retirement as she uncovers the hidden history in a former Jim Crow parish here in Louisiana. Welcome, Dr. Hayes.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here to join you and Antoinette in your efforts to educate our communities about the history of African Americans in this state. Thank you.
Well, you and I have a little bit of history. We kind of go back a few years, so it's always good to see you again.
Same thing, same thing.
So tell us, what have you been doing? I'll just start. What have you been doing during this pandemic year? And then we'll get into what you've been doing since retirement.
Well, during the pandemic year, I've been writing. I'm actually writing a couple of books, one with a colleague and a friend who is a poet, about Louisiana's first African-American woman to become a physician, Dr. Emma Wakefield Paye. And she had taken on the task of writing a book of poems about Dr. Paye, targeting children. And my mission, I guess, is to write a book about Reconstruction in the Bayou Country through the lives of Dr. Wakefield's family. And that family is so amazing. So they were so interesting. I mean, they produced a senator, they produced a clerk of court, like a lot of, there were many Black men who became politicians during Reconstruction that we haven't grown up not knowing anything about. But anyway, so I have been asked to contribute to that book of poetry, to contribute the prose, and that's what I've been working on. And I'm excited about that. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about that before we sign off tonight.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And of course, doing public presentations, hoping to enlighten communities about the true African-American story in my particular parish and related parishes like St. Martin and St. Mary that Iberia was carved out of. and helping people to understand that you can't assert or claim that you are, that the history of your community is full if it only focuses on one group in the community. And in Iberia, which I love very much, as a child growing up here in this parish and descendant of former West Africans who had been enslaved here, I grew up being told that the only people who made a contribution to this community were the Acadians and then the Spaniards. And that is not true. That's only part of the story. Because my people, the African Americans of this community, they've been marginalized in the storytelling of the history of this parish, just like in other Jim Crow era communities in the South.
Dr. Hayes, I'm so happy to hear you say not only Iberia Parish, but surrounding parishes as well, because oftentimes people really who are just beginning, especially family historians or new beginners, they focus on that parish that their family members are in. But you have to go back and look at when that parish was formed and from where it was formed. And you also have to look in those other areas if you're looking for your family history as well. So thank you for pointing that out.
Absolutely.
So all of your life, you have been a native of Iberia Parish?
I was born here. My family, I know that I found one of my lines here in the 1700s. Probably the early 1800s, because I think a lot of my people, other lines were brought here during the transatlantic slave trade. But from the time they got to this soil, they were in this particular location. And I want to back up a bit. I did find evidence of some of my people starting out in Virginia and a few in the Carolinas. I suspect that those who started there were the ones who were caught up in that trail of tears that African Americans who were enslaved were caught up in, where those tobacco plantations failed on the East Coast, and they marched or they shipped Blacks to the Deep South to work in cotton and sugarcane fields. So some of my ancestors came from West Africa by way of Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, and then to this area. Right? So
and is that on both sides of your family, mother and father?
Yes. But that's the story of most of us in this region. You know, but all we know really, if I hadn't done this research looking at the records, I would know nothing about Richmond and St. Petersburg, Virginia. I would know nothing about those communities. The others, because of census records, pension records of my Civil War veteran ancestors, I found out where their parents came from. Otherwise, as far as I know, my people have always been in what is now Iberia Parish, but they didn't start here. It's just in our recent memory, this is home, Iberia Parish wasn't formed until 1868, 3 years after after the emancipation in this area, and but it's interesting that my people have been here for so long, since the 19th and some of them the 18th century, and we know so little about who we are as a people until recently, where we came from, what was the path that led us here.
And you said that Iberia Parish wasn't formed until 1868. Was it carved out of another parish?
St. Martin, yes, St. Martin, big part of St. Martin, St. Mary Parish, a little bit of Vermilion. Those were the three major parishes. So when I look for my enslaved ancestors, once upon a time, Antoinette, I was doing exactly what you said beginning genealogists do. I just looked for my people in Iberia Parish courthouse records. They're there, but their records during enslavement are not there. My ancestors, my family lines, for me to study who they were owned by during enslavement, I had to go to St. Martin or St. Mary parishes. Exactly. And
And
I
that's
was told
something.
I was told that Vermilion didn't have any records because the records were burned. I think the lady explained during the Civil War. But I don't have Vermilion Parish ancestors anyway.
Did you find your ancestors on any of the inventories?
Yes.
You did.
Yes.
Who did you
And it's
find?
interesting. Okay. So it's very interesting because there are, I'm about, again, educating people. So I've heard the myth that, for example, like Cajuns did not own slaves.
Mhm.
One young lady came to my home and she was a housekeeper. So she was a temporary housekeeper for me. And she saw my papers on my dining room table, and I explained to her what I do, what my work is that I do as far as my historical research. And she said, you know, Miss Phoebe, my boyfriend so-and-so said that, you know, Acadians were too poor, Cajuns were too poor to have slaves. They didn't own slaves. And I listened to her and I said, well, let me show you some things. And I showed her probate record for Maximilian de Queer's estate, which showed some of my ancestors there. And I'm trying to remember which one now. My Michelle or Mitchell ancestors were on that plantation. Jean-Louis, some of them were there too. And I showed her how when he died, pieces of my family were distributed across his heirs. So they were sent in different directions. I said, these are my ancestors. And then I showed her Armand Broussard's probate record, right? And Josephat Broussard. And I remember one particular grouping in particular. I said, you see this lady here, Rosette. And she had, I think, 3 children with her at the time. One was Rosalie, one was uh, uh, Louis, and one was Jean. Jean was my 4 times great grandfather. Mm-hmm. And Jean then married, according to slave custom, a woman on the plantation, or as they called it, the community, named Mary Nancy. And Mary Nancy had Rosalie, a daughter named Rosette, who was named after Jean's sister, and a son named Sylvester. Well, Rosalie was my 3 times great grandmother. And so I showed her, and then when I looked at, the Wallette plantation, I was able to show her my people on those plantations. And so I wanted her to understand these were my ancestors. Mm-hmm. And they were owned by Acadians. I said, so yeah, there were a lot of people, white, who were poor and who didn't own slaves. Mm-hmm. But there were many who did. And that's how I ended up in this region, because they owned my ancestors. And you can't deny that.
Exactly. I have a question for you as well. Mm-hmm. When you first found the document that informed you that your ancestors was being sold that particular day, or praised, or sold, what feeling went through you as you held that document and you looked at that document? Share that moment with us.
Well, it was incredible to me. But what I focused on is the fact that we have been lied to so much. These were my people. So when we were taught history, and this is my pet peeve, people say, well, you're not angry. Sure, I'm angry. But I'm angry not just about slavery and Jim Crow. I'm angry about what has happened since then, where there was an intentional effort made to sanitize this history, hide the history, right? So slavery wasn't about these white slave owners who were benign and paternalistic, and they took care of their poor chattel, their poor human property, and they taught them a better way and brought Christianity to them. These were human beings who didn't need saving, right? And what gets me at times is the length to which educational systems have gone, and at least I'm talking about the time that I was educated, had gone to sanitize this history, make people believe that it wasn't bad. You know, I was brought up mostly in a segregated school system, and most of my teachers, my Black teachers, they would read what the school board told them that they had to read to us and teach the lesson the way they were told. But I remember my teachers saying, none of this is true, right? None of this is true. But little minds, people tend to believe what they see in print.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, even today, there are people, I can't, when you ask me, how did I feel? It's like, it blows my mind. Who would not be affected by seeing their ancestors? And not even just just human beings being
Mm-hmm.
owned like they were property. They were things to be possessed. You know, so from time to time I do these talks at Vermilionville in Lafayette, the Living History Museum, and I had one gentleman who during what they call Creole Culture Day. I'm not big on that word, so forgive me. But his point was, don't you believe that there were some slave owners who truly loved their slaves, and that their slaves truly loved them? Don't you think that? And I went, well, I'm quite sure there were people who thought that, you know, there was love in this mix, but it was power. I don't know what you call that. It's a power disparity. And can you really say that a captive loves his or her captor? You know, is that
Right.
an equal? Are they on equal footing? So there's a
Absolutely.
power disparity.
Right. Exactly.
And, you know, and I explained, even if these people could come back and say, yes, I truly love so and so and so. My thing is, I know how much I love my family and my children. And my husband and I, we've always had control over our children, especially when they were little guys, their destiny. Imagine you're a grown man or woman and you can't protect your family. You can't determine their destiny. You can't protect your daughters or your sons. And even if you have what's called a benign, at the time, benign slave owner, when that person died, everything was disrupted because the people who were owned by that benign master, they didn't know what was going to happen to them because they were dispersed. They were distributed across his heirs. So they didn't know if they were going to be sold to sell debts of the estate, or if they were going to be shipped 20 miles down the road and never see their loved ones again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a terrible thing when you don't feel that you have any control over your own family. A man can't protect his wife. A wife can't protect her husband, her children, etc. So I don't get this idea of a benign, loving relationship. I
No,
don't get that.
I
I don't
remember
get that.
that and I can remember that day as if it was just recently, finding on my mother's side of the family those enslaved records, those
Mhm,
inventory that listed my ancestors, and carrying, you know, my internet is unstable, so if I go out, you know what to do, just carry on.
mhm,
That was a very emotional day for me, and I really have to be forthcoming here because what it did, I actually was sick at the stomach. I cried. It's like I even regurgitated when I got home because it was this feeling, it was saying, and it was like this voice saying, let it go, bring it up so I can restore you with new knowledge. You have to. This is the pain. You know, this is the pain. You understand, are you feeling what they went through? You can't say I understand it, but to see that, or to know that their lives will be forever changed on this particular day by this particular cell, you know, never to see that loved one again.
yes.
Um, and I was watching this movie the other day. It was like The Daughters of the Dust. And as I was listening to one of the speak about this boy who sometimes children would leave the plantation, boy or girl, and they would come back later on as a man or woman, and they would have these sexual relationships or marriage with someone on the plantation that possibly could have been their sister, their brother, their mom, or their dad.
And they
And
didn't know.
so oftentimes people talk about genealogy, and people have said that genealogy is and was and still is the number one growing hobby in the nation. Well, it's not a hobby for us because we're still
You're looking.
157 years later trying to find our ancestors and connecting the dots. And Karen can attest to this because we're still finding our great great father Randall's brother Thomas descendants. You want to speak that, Karen?
Absolutely, and thanks to DNA and connecting up with all of those cousins that we didn't know of 20 years ago, when I first became more knowledgeable about our history, when I found Antoinette's book and read about so many more. But now we're finding these cousins spread all over the country,
Right.
spread all over the country, and being able to connect with them.
And I do want to share something from Dr. Hayes' work here, because first of all, let's just say that we really appreciate you. We really appreciate all the work that you have done, still doing, and will continue to do as
Thank
long
you.
as there's breath in your body. It's simply
Thank
because
you.
we just don't give this up, and there's no such thing as quitting this work because we can't. Now this, I don't know how many plaques you all have in the area of historic land to sort of identify these historic places, but here in Tangipahoa Whole Parish, we have so little. Could you please tell us about this particular plaque and the
Yes.
movement around it?
Okay, so just what you said, there are so few markers, plaques that represent a visual representation of the history of African Americans in our community. And I believe strongly that we need to have visual symbols of that history, representations of that history. So I first want to say this is our first marker that we put down in honor of Louisiana's first woman. It's not just, if I could redo this marker, but history is something that keeps unfolding. Mm-hmm. If I could redo this marker, it would say Louisiana's first woman to graduate from a medical school, or the first woman to graduate from a medical school in Louisiana. And she's the first African-American woman to practice medicine here, because I grew up here all my life, as I said, not knowing this. So I want people, when they come to our community, to see representations of the contributions of our people, or even those events that affected our people significantly in this community. Prior to this marker, there was one, and the marker in the historic district, and it was dedicated to a woman by the name of Félicité. And she supposedly came from Haiti with the Debunking family. We don't know, and that's the only contention that I make. I don't know what proof there is. We have not been able to find proof other than a newspaper article or two that say that she nursed everyone who had been affected by the yellow fever epidemic in 1839 in New Iberia. And every mantle had her picture. She nursed the sick, closed the eyes of the dead. But there are no pictures of this lady. No one even knows the true story. They go back and forth as to whether or not she was actually enslaved. So my point is, when I look at these newspapers of the day, a lot of it's propaganda. A lot of it's, if you want to be revered or respected by the white community, Black person, then you have to serve us or entertain us. So this is the model that you have to reach for to replicate. So and I'm not taking anything away from her, but I knew we had people we had evidence And I want to talk about Dr. Wakefield and how I found out about her. Jari Honore, New Orleans genealogist, historian, mentioned her in her achievement in an online blog that he has, which I'm sure everyone knows about, Creole Gen. And when in the article, he mentioned her as actually graduating first with a medical degree, and she was from New Iberia. That piqued my interest. And that's what started my research of the Wakefield family, right? And I found out, so her father was a senator representing our area. I never knew about these people. And this family lived in the heart of New Iberia, Louisiana, and their memory has been erased. And our organization has sought to bring their story back. That's to resurrect this family, right? But in the process, we also found other things. Like her brother was our first and only clerk of court, Black clerk of court, I should say. We didn't know this. And it all started with an article Jari had in his blog about Emma Wakefield that started me researching this family even further. So yes, so we have the marker. Then in 1944, all the Black doctors were beaten and expelled from Iberia Parish because they dared to advocate for Black families where the men wanted a welding school so they could get out of those fields and become skilled laborers and do what? Work in the emerging industry, especially the emerging oil and gas industry, right? And provide a decent living for their families. And I often think this is more than what people. I think it's a story that people have to truly understand economically, because this is 1944. Oil and gas was discovered in Louisiana, I think, at the turn of the century. White families had been having access to the middle class. When's the last time a family could lift their families up to the middle class when the father is a yard man or a field hand? The mother doesn't work or she's a maid. Now, some families, through whatever process they got there, they were able to educate but the majority of African Americans in the South, especially the rural South and Jim Crow era, they were locked out of jobs that were considered to be jobs for white men. And I tell, I know you asked me about the markers, but each one of these markers, there's a story behind them.
Yes.
And there's a reason, and we always tell those stories. There's a reason for us putting those markers up. Those doctors were heroes, and they risked their own lives, their incomes, their families' well-being to do this advocacy. And some of them, along with NAACP leaders of the time, they were threatened. And one of them died about a year after the beating he received. And who were the people, the perpetrators behind this? Well, the sheriff, his deputies, the superintendent of the schools, and the planners who didn't want to lose those field hands, right? So then my argument has always been, I want to understand, I want to know what was the economic impact, not just on the African American population, which was roughly half of the population here in Iberia, but on this community even to today, because intentionally, half the population was impoverished, right? Half the population was intentionally impoverished. Do you know how much more money the merchants and others in the community could have made if everybody had an opportunity to have a decent income?
Of course, of course.
And I think we're suffering to this day.
Exactly. And looking at genealogy through a microscope, it is so much that we learn on the local level.
That's right.
The local politics, the local
That's the microscope
of economics.
Yes.
And so a lot of times people don't understand the powerful connection that genealogy makes. For instance, let me say this. everyone know about the history on a national level for African American people, but how many people really understand the history on a local level without
Thank you.
doing genealogy research,
Thank you.
without putting your family in the picture, or placing your family in the picture, and learning about the people who was in political control or economic control or control of the school boards. All these things that
And the
is
impact.
very important. It had an impact and still having an
That's
impact
right.
on our lives. Now we can take Texas for example, where people are saying that it's so much that Texas don't even want to talk about anymore because it's really shining the light on those who do not want their dark history told, but it is our history. And so our history and what our ancestors and went through, and I believe I love this one phrase here, it said, it's the past that shapes the present. Now listen to that carefully. The past that shapes the present and the present that shapes the future. If we don't look at our own families and their place value in the society in which they live, we will not learn about the land. We will not learn about the patents. We will not learn about nothing that our families contribute, earn, and left to us without looking at our own family history.
That's right.
Our history, her history, your history, our history. So
That's
when
right.
Webster left out the other, our story, her story, their story, it's not just his
His story.
story.
Right. You know,
And
there's
so,
resist going. I'm sorry.
Dr. Hayes,
Mm-hmm.
I found this picture, and this picture reminds me of a picture that I found in the Mississippi Delta that we took.
That's right.
And of course, when we go back into history and understanding that, now we know that this picture is a recent picture, but this picture also sets the tone for a picture back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us
But it's
about that.
not. It's recent.
Exactly.
It's just what my point is. If you have, oh, John McCusker did that. So is the photographer. But the West End
Mhm.
is an example that a lot of people have focused on here in Iberia. But there are so many other communities of that are impoverished. And it's not a surprise that most of those communities are communities of color, African American primarily.
Mhm.
Think about it. If your ancestors have been denied access to a decent living because of blatant racism, dating way back, you understand then, people should be able to understand then why folks are still living in certain conditions, right?
Oh my
And
goodness.
and that's what they have to understand. Um, there was a point there's a lady who, my mother would have been 88 had she lived. One of her friends who was at Southern University at the time called me to tell me about her father. Her father was the first Black garbage man here in Iberia. She came back home from Southern University, and her family told her how a white man held a gun or a rifle on her father because he was in a white neighborhood, and the man did not believe that a Black man should have been a garbage man. And he told him, this is not a job for the N-word. This is a white man's job, right? A garbage man. This is, so again, men could be field hands or yard boys, right? But that's it. Unless they went to school by some divine intervention and got educated. But even then, they had to know their place.
Mm.
You know, so New Iberia, and I'm sorry because
Go ahead.
things are coming back to me. New Iberia, I have a. People are uncomfortable in general about us doing family history research,
Mhm.
right? or uncovering history. And I had to think about that. Why would it make people uncomfortable? I didn't say everyone, because I've had a lot of cooperation and support and encouragement, but there are some who are uncomfortable. And I have concluded that to tell our story truthfully, completely, we're going to focus on some of the ugly things. So to tell the story of these Black men who were beaten because they wanted to get out of the field, or they wanted to advocate for Blacks who wanted to get better jobs. And then those veterans from World War II who just a few months later came home with those GI bills, and they could not use those bills in the same way that their white comrades could. They were relegated to communities like the Mixon Project, which is where that picture was taken. They could use it there, but they couldn't go on the other side of the bayou and use it in one of those new developments. Because why? The government stopped it. They had the redlining. The government stopped it. The banks wouldn't give them money to build homes or to buy homes in those neighborhoods, and the developers wouldn't allow it. And then they had these, and I know you know about this, they had these documents, restrictions that said if a white family wanted to do the right thing and sell their home to a Black family, they were not allowed. Legally, they were not allowed.
And that still exists today now. There's still some communities that way. I want to turn it to my
But they can report that.
Exactly. Karen has a question. There's a comment coming from the chat room. Go ahead, Karen. It's in your, you have
Yes. And Dr. Hayes, I first want to thank you for doing this community research, because when we are doing our family history, our family members didn't live by themselves. They were a part of a community, and it is wonderful that you're elevating other members of your community. So I just wanted to say that first of all, but coming from the chat room, our mammies, that's Gaynell from iMammies, she wants you to break down the term yard boys.
My father at one point, because Daddy had several jobs, a lot of times just to make a decent living. So these were men, now you understand that's not my term. These were men who were hired to cut grass, do the trimming, right? And keep the lawns in those neighborhoods that they were not allowed to live in, keep them immaculate, manicured, right? So those are the men they called yard boys, right? And that's the way they thought of them. But I can remember my father working as a yard boy or yard man, working at the pumping gas at the filling station. And then he even worked on one of the highways, building the highways, but he always had to have 2 or 3 jobs to make a decent living, right? And it's interesting because for example, the oil and gas industry, and I feel as if I'm kind of going all over, but I'm so passionate about this history and making people understand just how unfair it was and why you have communities that are still impoverished today. My school was desegregated in 1969, I think it was. We entered New Iberia Senior High as 10th graders. And I went to school with classmates, white classmates, and they talked about their fathers working 7 on, 7 off, right? That was not a mental framework that I had growing up, understanding about my father going to work 7 days offshore. What is that? But my father would have given his right arm to work offshore to provide for his family. Now, he eventually got an industrial job years later at the sugar mill as a house mechanic. But he would have given his right arm to have the kind of job and the kind of income so he and my mother could educate their children, right? The way they wanted us educated. And I'm now, this is 1969, 70. And Black men were not working in the oil and gas industry. I can remember when I went away to college, that's when I began, my family would write back and tell me about different people that, men and who were working in the oil and gas industry. And then I came home and I saw these guys driving these trucks with these big rigs, these big welding rigs. And then I began to understand. But do you understand how if my father and other Black men had had the opportunity to earn that type of living, even in 1944, when the doctors were advocating how that wealth could have been passed down, they would have been able to buy homes in better neighborhoods that built wealth, right?
And I do want to point out that for all the listeners is that when they speak about yard boys, if one that's listening that may not understand, we're not talking about boys.
We're talking about grown men.
We're talking about grown men. And
with families.
Men that could have been in their 70s was still referred to as boys. And so that's why I have a hard time when sometimes women, you know how you have these conversations and they'll say that boy. And now mind you that when they say that, oh, that boy. Now I'm thinking they're talking about a little boy, but they are referring to a man as a boy. And so I think that that's another thing that we need to understand, break down these terminologies, boys, the word rascal, the word joker, those other words that was referred, you know, and when I hear people say that joker or that rascal, I remember some of my uncles that word was forbidden in the household. You couldn't call somebody a joker or a rascal, or another word that they would use instead of calling that person Mr. or Mrs., auntie and uncle. You see, and so in the study of genealogy, we start to learn about not only our history, but like you said, Dr. Hayes, we're learning a community genealogy. Yes. We'll learn about those. And there's no way at all that if your family was enslaved, you have a double sword genealogy research to do. That's to learn about those that enslaved your family as well as your family genealogy.
You definitely have to understand their genealogy.
Questions, comments? Well, we're having a good conversation in the chat room about the economics of it all. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. Our people were brought here because of economics, and there is a fear of us building wealth and passing wealth forward. And you know,
isn't that silly? Don't we as a society benefit if everyone succeeds who want to succeed?
It is
because wealth is built. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that it is silly. It's but it is their fear. They don't want
silly to me.
Right, it's their fear. They don't want us to be on equal terms. Mm-hmm. But this is why learning our history is so important, and sharing our history is even more important, because it's not just for us and our families, it's for everyone to learn our history.
And I want people to question, well, I never knew this. They never taught us this in school. And that's what I have been getting, the kind of reaction I've been getting. And I started making the point about why some people are resistant to this history being researched and taught. Because for you to understand what my ancestors went through, what our ancestors went through, then you have to understand the role that other people's ancestors played in that history of brutality, of enslavement. We didn't enslave ourselves. And even sometimes I'll get people that say, well, Black people own slaves. Well, yeah, so what's your point? Of course, there were Blacks who wanted to emulate those people who were in power, and they may have owned slaves. Many bought their children and their relatives out of slavery because that was the only way they could free them. But the point is, slavery was wrong, and that's what I want. The other point I want to make is I have learned so much from those veterans' pension records. A lot confirmed what I already had suspected, but I learned so much. Even one of my the 4 times great grandparents I started talking about, that was Jean and Mary Nancy. They married according to the records, slave customs. Those were the terms they used. They said that their owners gave them permission, and they had children. And everybody, according to testimony, recognized them as being a couple and the children as being theirs. For some reason, Mary Nancy, and I tell her story in this book that I'm writing, Mary Nancy was sold away from her children. Now, in court testimony, my 3 times great grandmother, Rosalie, said that they were very young when their mother was taken from them. And this was against the law at that time with those codes. They had to be like adolescent for them to be sold away from their mother. But she said they were like 4 or 5 years old. And so she was sold to someone in New Orleans, and I'm still looking for her to see who sold her. But the husband eventually married someone else. And many years later, in the early 1900s, there was a lawsuit. Just bear with me. There was a lawsuit. My grandmother claimed that her stepbrother, her half brother, was trying to take the estate and trying to disclaim her as being her father's heir. So they brought all these witnesses, including the children of the former slave owners who testified. You know what it boiled down to, why the brother won? Because they couldn't find any witnesses who could say they heard Josephat and Suzanne Broussard give permission for them to marry. They couldn't find, but the wife, the second wife, was able to find the witnesses to the slave owners giving permission. So what gets me is they had to prove that these white people gave them permission to do something that is just so natural, which is to marry and to form a family. Mm. And in the 20th century, these people were all dead, and they didn't have any way to prove their birth history. So it's just amazing to me, just simple things our ancestors did not have the freedom to partake in.
And I do want to point out this because it's very important, especially for children and for those that is trying to learn this history. We must change our terminology when it comes down to slaves. They was enslaved because they was forced to be.
That's
right. Because when a lot of the people who are just learning, they think they kidnapped slaves from Africa. We have to be very clear that they kidnapped free people, women, men, children, that live in a community just like any community in any other parts of the world. And they was forced into slavery. So enslaved, my ancestors was enslaved. And so we think about reparations, and we think about identifying who was our ancestors. My ancestors was only enslaved because the captives that held them enslaved them.
That's right.
Took away their freedom, took away those freedom of liberties that they had before they came into this country. And so
and their identity.
And their identity. They took away everything and forced them to be those prisoners enslaved on these plantations. And so I want to say to anyone, once you get past looking at those beautiful photographs, if you come across any documents that you may find, genealogy, when you shake that tree, you will find out there's some things that Big Mama didn't want to talk about and other people in the family because it was too painful, because you are opening that door. You're opening that door to lynchings. You're opening that door to rapes. You're opening that door to people taking your children. You're opening that door to so
Your
many.
property.
That's right, properties, murders. And so please understand, I think everyone here, Dr. Karen, all of us have expertise at research and genealogy, and we can assure you at one time or another, you're going to hear some dark parts of history.
Yes, you do.
That involves your ancestors in a community.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Anybody want to comment on that?
May I say, I
Yeah.
have a friend whose her sister and I graduated together, and we were having a conversation, and she said, we were talking about all the things that had happened. And look, history is not always ugly, but you can't hide from the ugly parts of history. So we were talking about lynchings, and she said, but you know what, Phoebe, I'm so glad that didn't happen here. I said, what didn't happen here? Well, all these things like lynchings and beatings. And I don't get hysterical. And so for me, it's like, okay, you teach. And I said, well, we were a Jim Crow community, former slave state. How do you think they enforce the rules, the codes, the laws that they established to keep Black people in line? I said, how do you think they did that? Maybe we didn't have the Ku Klux Klan, but we had other groups that were just as bad. They were just Catholics, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do you think that? Of course, we had lynchings, and I told her about the bridges and the area's trees that supposedly, you know, where Black men were hung here in Iberia Parish. I said we weren't any better than any other Jim Crow community of that time. So of course, and so it's if we lull ourselves into believing that we were better than, then we don't have to look within and look under, the curtain to see what other things happened. Because I'm telling you, when you start looking at, okay, so people were lynched, then that leads you to, well, who did the lynchings?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're talking about a local community.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people who did the lynchings and the beatings,
Mm-hmm.
they're related to.
That's right.
Just like some of the people who were lynched and beaten, I'm related to, right? Our histories are intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate that there were people, I used to think, I thought about how hypocritical this was. There were people who were just beaten. I'll tell you one instance. Sam Wakefield, who was Dr. Emma Wakefield's father, was a very literate man. And he was the American Missionary Association. I found on a little envelope that I got from the Amistad Center that described him as being very influential, very intelligent. He was a former state senator, but he had been an informant to this missionary society or association about a lynching that happened during slavery times. 2 Black men escaped. And there's not enough information for me to know where, because I want to find out more. But they escaped from slavery and they were caught. When they were beaten, and this is Iberia Parish, or in what would become St. Mary Parish and St. Martin Parish, what later became Iberia. The soles of their feet were slit open with a knife. And Sam Wakefield reported this to the American Missionary Association. And so the soles of their feet were cut and they were hung. And the reason he knew it, he was able to report this, was because he was an eyewitness, because the perpetrators of this cruel, brutal act had, according to the testimony, had men, enslaved men, I think they said from 15 miles around, to be brought to the spot where they were going to kill these men so they could witness it. Now, why? To deter.
Intimidation.
That's it, to make sure that didn't happen again.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
But they reported on it. And I know there has to be more of this record that exists. This was what became Iberia Parish. So people can't lull themselves to a calm and peaceful sleep at night saying, this didn't happen here.
Right.
These men did what they did. Then they went home, took a bath, ate dinner with their families, and they went to mass.
As if not, exactly.
Nothing, they did nothing wrong. Their community was safe, right?
Mm.
And
Karen,
Emma's
any
little
more
brother, before I go, Emma's little brother at 17 years old was lynched in New Iberia. Now, he wasn't hung, he was shot because he supposedly killed a man who had beaten him, and he carried a gun. And according to him, he was defending himself. Well, that didn't work in 1889. They went crazy here in New Iberia. And where Dr. Wakefield's marker is today, which is Bulani Plaza, our town square, behind it was where the courthouse was. Adjacent to the courthouse was the jail. Sammy, whose picture Jari alerted me to, is at the Historic New Orleans collection. Sammy at 17 was shot because they were fighting with the sheriff to take him, and someone shot him through the heart instantly. So our history isn't pretty either.
No, it's
And
not.
that's what I want people around the South to, not even the South, because it makes it seem as if the North was wonderful. There was Jim Crow and violence there too. And y'all know this, but I want people to understand how important it is to research this history, to form historical societies like we did, whose mission is to research it, look for the evidence, teach it, commemorate it with markers, write about it like you all have begun to do, write about it, put those books in libraries and other public spaces, because if you go to public libraries now, you're going to find Jim Crow era texts, right? I found books about the great doctors that have no Blacks, even though we have had over 20 Black doctors associated with this parish since the 1800s. The Black veterans of Iberia from the Civil War on have been excluded from Jim Crow era books. And my people, I come from a long line of men who were veterans. There are men in cemeteries, in these historically Black cemeteries, who are lying there with military markers saying KIA for killed in action, World War II, World War I, Civil War, Spanish-American War. Their histories are untold, unspoken, if we don't do the research, teach it and write about it and put it in those libraries next to those Jim Crow texts.
Wow, this is such a powerful conversation tonight, and unfortunately our time is almost expiring.
Oh, shucks.
I do want to say that before I turn it over to Karen, I would like for us to start a movement where we start to educate and have these discussions, that we should not make fun of the history, of the triumphs of what our families had to go through, because we was in this conversation today and we were saying that you never see the Jewish community laughing, mocking, or finding funny moments in a comedian way about
nothing funny about what they
and
know.
I don't blame them for that.
There's nothing funny about that.
You never find the Native Americans laughing about the Tears of Trail, the Tears of Trail, the Tears of Trail. We as people must realize that we are not going to get that respect that is due us until we start carrying ourselves in that way and holding those things that is sacred in high standards. And so everything is not a laughing moment. I don't care what comedian is saying it or what comedian, because they're well known, will make fun of what suffering our ancestors went through and that we are still going through as a people. I'm turning it over to you, Karen, because our time is almost up. Is that you now?
I know I have just a quick brief question for Dr. Hayes. You mentioned we didn't have KKK, but you said the Catholics. And I was wondering.
No, not that the Catholics did it. What my
Right.
point is that the Klan has been
Oh.
anti-black, anti-Jewish,
Mm.
anti-Catholic, right? So people had some of the same hateful organizations. They just weren't the Klan, right?
Okay.
They were, I think it's the White League, the White Camellias,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they could continue to worship, you know.
Yeah.
And I want to really quick say something about how we study history, because it goes back to what Dr. Harrell said. The children have to be taught early on this true history. There's Black history, and every year the children they're given their heroes. And I take nothing from Dr. King and Mrs. Parks and Sojourner Truth, etc. But they know about them. It's memorized, but they don't know about the people in their own communities, some who they're related to, who contributed to their own history, who made their communities better, who risk everything for their communities. There are Black mayors that children adults know nothing about in the Deep South. Why is that? Why is it I'm in my 60s and I learned that we had a Black clerk of court? The clerk of courts, and these are my friends, they didn't know about it because that history has been buried, right? So
Well, we're
there's a
here
lot
to
to
tell
unpack.
these stories,
That's right.
and we thank you for
Thank
sharing
y'all for
so much of
inviting
this
me.
history. We know you have so much more to share. And I just want to thank everybody who's in the
Thank
chat
you.
room. There's been a nice conversation, especially about the economics of it all. And you guys can continue that conversation in the chat. In the comments, since the show is about to end. And we will see. I'll let Antoinette tell you about when we will see you again.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Before we really hit that button tonight, I just want to say to you, first of all, we want to thank everyone that has followed us weekly. And foremost, let me just thank Dr. Phoebe Hayes for this very informative, educational power hour of discussions with her about the work that she and her organization is doing in New Iberia. And we just cannot commemorate her and her work enough, because she is really on the ground doing some groundbreaking new discoveries as it relates to local history and genealogy as well. So thank you once again, Dr. Hayes. It has been a power for hour of just listening to you. Um, what we're going to start doing, we're going to start next month bringing our show to bi-weekly, because we're ready to hit the courthouses and other research facilities now that COVID has somewhat given us a little room. And so that when we come back in the fall and resume with our weekly broadcast, we can have some new developments. But what we'll be doing is reporting to you live at the different locations that we will be researching at. So our first show will be next week, which is the first week, which is a Tuesday, and then the following week it'll be the third week of the month. So certainly we're going to be here. We just will not be doing it every Tuesday. It'll be bi-weekly. And once again, so please share this link with other people. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, we would love to hear from you. No matter where you are in the United States, we would love to hear what you are doing in your community as far as genealogy, documenting, researching, documenting, and sharing that local history, because it's very important. Yes, as Dr. Hayes said, that we can look at history on a national level, and a lot of times, yes, we'll forget about those heroes and sheroes in our own family. No disrespect by no means to Dr. King, Queen Mother Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. But what we would like for you to do is what Karen and I say every day, every Tuesday on our show, that ordinary people with extraordinary stories. And you will not know those stories if you do not do your research. And it's very important that you start talking to the elders in your family to learn about your family history. So once again, we just want to thank you for following us weekly, and we do want to share with you. Please help to share this show with other people on your pages. So let me just go ahead and say, hey, you know what we do at the end of the show? We want you to hit that button. So give us one moment, and here it is. I'm going to go ahead and hit that button, Karen.
Thank you for joining us on Nurturing Our Roots. Please give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our videos. Thank you for joining us on Nurturing.
Okay, and I just want to say to everyone, thank you. As always, you can email Karen and I at nurturingourroots@gmail.com. And I know that we'll be posting some more information. If you want to get in contact with Dr. Phoebe Hayes, we would like for her to just put that email out there if someone would like to contact her. Dr. Hayes, can you please come back on and put that email out there for everybody?
Do you want me to just say it? Because
Yes.
I'm not, oh, okay. So the email is info for our organization, which is the Iberia African American Historical Society. It's info@iahsonline.org.
Dr. Hayes, once again, it is our honor to have
Thank you.
you as a special guest on our show tonight. And we learned so much from you about the important work that you and your organization is doing. So once again, thank you for joining us right here on Nurturing Our Roots from Slavery
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good night, Karen.
Good night. Good night, everybody.